Time's expired. David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to take what I would normally consider a short call on this bill, but in comparison with some of the offerings we've heard this evening, it might be a relatively long monologue. The government, one would imagine, would have quite a lot riding on this bill. It was one of the major planks of their election campaign a couple of years ago. It was one of the major infrastructure investments that were going to turn around our economy, to make this a better place, to provide all sorts of useful services. And yet the government members in the House tonight seem to have remarkably little to say about it. And one would expect a degree of commitment, a degree of confidence, dare I say it, even some pride in this legislation. And that doesn't seem to be coming through this evening. It's interesting to note that not only has that been observed in this House, but looking at some social media earlier this evening before I came into the House, there are some comments on there to the effect that people are wondering why the government is so reluctant to advance some robust arguments in support of their own legislation. One commentator suggested that perhaps they just didn't have too much to say, but others have noted that that hasn't stopped them speaking at length on previous occasions. So, to what are the benefits proposed? The Greens will in fact support this bill to Select Committee, albeit with major reservations, and of course reserving the right to withdraw that support if we don't see some needed changes to this bill. We recognise the considerable benefits of fast and ultra-fast broadband, and those are well known both locally and internationally. There are considerable advantages for business to establishing this facility, this infrastructure. I know from my own experience, my former life as a business advisor around sustainability, that the ability to communicate not only with voice but also through images is a significant advantage. I worked with a number of large companies who invested quite heavily in video conferencing equipment, which not only reduced their costs, their operating costs, it saved time of their employees, it reduced their carbon footprint considerably, and enabled them to have high-quality communications to do business over the wires rather than requiring people to travel around the country. And there's a clear advantage to that, and this ultra-fast will facilitate that. It will enable people to choose particular lifestyles, conceivably take pressure off our urban centres to the extent that people using this infrastructure could choose to live in rural environments and still have all the instant communication advantages of living in the city. And for that reason, I think it's not a bad thing that some of the initial rollouts will be in the smaller provincial and indeed the rural areas. That's desirable on many levels. It will be a very valuable educative tool. It'll put children, students in our rural schools as well as our urban schools within very easy reach of information. It will enable the sort of initiative we saw recently where we saw a virtual conference held in New Zealand, an academic conference engaging people from around the country that was conducted for the most part as a virtual conference. There are major advantages in this sort of technology, and for that reason we'll lend it our qualified support at this point. We must recall, however, this technology, like every other, is not a panacea. It is a technology. It is a tool. And we have this unfortunate habit of allowing our technological capability to run in advance of our social adjustments. We often invest heavily in research into technology and rather too little into our own sociology of place, of community. Faster communication is not necessarily always better communication, and it's important that we do maintain awareness and continue to research and to think very hard about the social and indeed cultural consequences of some of these new technologies in our haste to adopt them and to adapt them. We ought not to lose sight of the larger picture, not to lose sight of the reality that these sorts of technologies do affect social change as well as providing tools for business, for education, for standard forms of communication. In essence then, this bill sets out the path for the government's rollout of the ultra-fast broadband, the Rural Broadband Initiative, and makes changes to the TSO, the Telecommunications Service obligations. and it's it's on the surface a reasonably complicated document. It almost perhaps overly complex, one would think. But in essence, it's about much of the bill is about working out who pays what and when and in what circumstances. A great deal of the bill focuses on pricing, on who will pay, on how prices will be managed and regulated. And therein lies some of the rub with this bill. It gives new powers to the Telecommunications Commissioner. The bill's notable for its explanatory note, where we see that future amendments may be needed to law changes that facilitate the breakup of Telecom should that company win part or some part of the tender to roll out the UFB initiative. The provision to substantially alter the bill in the fact that Telecom does win some part of the tender means to some extent we are heading into unknown territory with this, and there is a degree of scepticism and concern that the arguments at committee will have to be made that that's an appropriate course of action, and that we are careful to iron out and to attend to all the possible ramifications of that. The matter of the regulatory holiday, the 9 or 10 year relief from regulation, if you like, has been mentioned already, and indeed it has been commented on at some length in the interested media, in Computer World, in the Internet New Zealand, Tuans, among others, have all had comments to make, and there's some very real and some very serious concerns within that community of interest, the ICT community, people who know, understand best, and who can think through the consequences of getting this wrong.
Order. Sorry to interrupt the member. The time has come for me to leave the chair. I shall resume the chair at 9 a.m.